Right. Right. So, hi, David. So, welcome on this fine afternoon, and really glad that you've taken the opportunity to talk to us. So, I just wondered if you could introduce yourself and just explain how you got involved with Family Education Trust.
Sure, my name's David Paton. I'm a Professor of Industrial Economics at Nottingham University Business School. And quite a number of years ago, I started looking into some of the economics research, looking at the impacts of not the rights and wrongs, but rather sort of what happens when you change abortion policy or when you allow contraception in schools for young people. What's the statistical evidence on the impact on pregnancy rates? And I did a study looking at the Gillick ruling back in the early 2000s, looking at whether when Victoria Gillick went to court and for a short period, family planning clinics were unable to give contraception to girls under the age of 16 without parental advice. And there was concerns at the time that that had led to an increase in teenage pregnancies. So I looked at the statistical evidence on that. And funnily enough, it actually made no difference, or at least did not decrease teenage pregnancy rates. And that study, I think, was of interest to Family Education Trust. And I got to meet the late Norman Wells, and we had a chat, and I was invited to speak at the AGM, I think back in 2003. And I've had a sort of, contact with Norman quite a while after that, until he died. And obviously, I think Family Education Trust do a fantastic job. So I really respect what you've done over those years, standing up really for some sanity in how we approach sexual health and the rights of children and underage sex and so on.
Yeah, okay. Oh, that's great. So Norman's report, which was published back in 2017, Unprotected, which detailed the extensive failings of authorities in protecting vulnerable children from child sexual exploitation, particularly in the towns like Rochdale and Rotherham that had come out at the time. That was obviously, a big report that Norman wrote. And you wrote the foreword for that. What were your feelings at the time as to what had allowed this extensive abuse to happen?
Well, looking at the research on underage contraception, it was always a concern to me that actually schools providing contraception without parents being involved is a risk factor for abuse, because of course children at 13, 14, 15, maybe in chaotic lives, it's quite hard to know, well, who is their partner, what's really going on there. And the big emphasis the government's had for many years has been on confidential provision of sexual health, contraception, morning after pill, even abortion. And confidential means that, although in theory, under the sort of Gillick competence, they should encourage parents to be involved. You can imagine a 14 or 15-year-old, not being very willing, and it's not so hard, it seemed to become normal that should be provided without parents being involved. So there was a risk there. And then I was giving some evidence to the House of Commons Education Select Committee on compulsory sex education, and it came to my attention that there had been one of these serious case review reports from Oxfordshire had actually highlighted that this had happened, that there'd been the role of young girls being provided with contraception in the case when it ended up they were being abused and in some cases groomed, and it meant they hadn't been picked up. And indeed, in one case, they'd been taken for an abortion, which is an obvious intervention point, but there hadn't been intervention, and it meant that the abuse had continued. Now, when I looked around, it wasn't just one serious case review. There were a number of these. So I got in touch with Norman because I thought it'd be of interest to him, and passed over the data from 4 or 5 reports that I'd seen where this issue had been very explicitly raised, and they'd actually said, well, we need to look again at Gillick competency, because there's this contradiction between saying that we have the age of consent at 16, but at the same time, we're willing to provide girls as young as 12 or 13 even with contraception and even abortion without parents being involved. So we have this sort of tension about, can you really give consent at that sort of age? So Norman was very interested, and the report, by the way, was all Norman's. I sort of passed over some information on what I'd seen in these reports. But he in fact discovered other serious case reviews, and picked out a pattern. And there was this really quite serious pattern that wasn't just one-off cases. There's a systematic role, and people had focused on the issue of grooming gangs, quite rightly. It's very worrying, but it was much more systematic than this. This was state-aided policies which were actually perpetuating child sexual exploitation and abuse, and it wasn't always grooming gangs. So there was a very sad case of a special needs school of a young girl who had been judged to be Gillick competent and had been provided with contraception, having sex with a much older person, and it was quite shocking. And when the mother found out, of course, in this report, she was quite shocked. So that wasn't a grooming case in the sense we think about in Rochdale, but of course that was another case. You had these grooming gangs, across the country, and a number of the reports in Rotherham, Rochdale, and other areas were identifying, and time again, the serious case reviews were identifying the role of Gillick competency, this contradiction that we have, that underage sex was in some sense normalised and young girls were seen as being given consent, and that's how the police approached it, that they're not necessarily victims because they've given consent to this, which of course, although we see that as being absolutely wrong, fits in with how sex and sexual education was being done within schools, which was very much along the lines of, well, consent's important, but that's a sufficient condition. So the message, and you hear it quite a lot, is sort of, well, only have sex when you are ready to have sex. But if you think about that, putting that in a sort of values-free way, what that means is you could be 12 or 13 or 14, slightly immature, and think, well, yeah, I've been going out with my boyfriend for 3 weeks. He clearly really loves me. So yes, I'm ready to have sex. All my friends say they're doing it. You can see how these things can work. So it's a very, very damaging message that and still is being given out. But you had backed up by this systematic provision. So it's the government recommendation that schools should be providing contraception to girls under the age of 16 and boys indeed, confidentially. So assuring them that they're confidential, because they think, well, this is the way you can increase take-up and you'll reduce teenage pregnancies. Of course, all the evidence suggests that isn't the case. You don't even reduce teenage pregnancies, which is one of the ironies of this whole approach. But you leave the door open to this, sexual exploitation.
Yeah, that's hugely concerning. And what has concerned us even more is that, having seen this, the 18th report that's just come out from the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, and it's listing the extensive failures in more towns now, and I'm pretty sure that it's probably going on in almost every town in the country, that despite like Norman's report and previous reports, that this is still happening. And not only is it still happening, but it's just going further and further underground, because police are just, like you said in this latest report, police are saying that even victims as young as, say, 11, that's just been described in the official reports as having multiple sexual partners and choosing a promiscuous lifestyle, which is just crazy when you think of the age of these children, and the fact that the local authorities, social services have just turned a blind eye to it. And I suppose what's more worrying is that even though there's recommendations in this report, they're not mandatory. These authorities are not required to make these changes. So what do you think needs to change? I mean, it would be horrifying, wouldn't it, if we get to a 19th, 20th report and nothing's changed and this is still happening, and we're still seeing this extensive sexual exploitation of young children. What do you think? Do we need to change? Do you think we need an overhaul of how this is dealt with?
Well, we need to firstly accept where the problems lie. And I had a look at the latest report, and it identifies some important issues about the role of the police and the approach to grooming gangs and so on, and that's important. But actually it really missed the point in terms of sexual health services. It actually made a comment somewhere that it being a problem that not all children have easy access to sexual health services, as if that's an intervention point. And indeed, of course, it might potentially be where you can pick up sexual abuse. But what the report didn't do was tackle this point, which came up time and time again in the serious case reviews, of how sexual health services are working. So, for example, the Newcastle report back from about, I think it was 4 years ago, but specifically identified, it said the vast majority of young girls who are being groomed or involved in sexual exploitation will go to sexual health services and will be prescribed, will be given contraception. So that intervention point, and it's not just enough to say, well, we'll keep an eye out for for sexual abuse and so on, because if you're still pursuing this idea that it's okay to give a 12 or 13 or 14-year-old contraception without their parents being involved, or indeed at all, you could perhaps argue, then it's very hard to see how you can stop that cycle of abuse, that you're not, and people I think do it for the right. That no, it's not, because it doesn't lead to lower rates of teenage pregnancy, but it does lead you to being, open to abuse. Did we lose a connection there, Lucy?
Yeah, just slightly, but we came back on, so it's only a couple of seconds. So yeah.
Okay, so a couple of things in terms of, you asked what do you think we should be doing. Well, I think, as I said, we need to recognise the problem. I think there's some very practical things that can be done. So one issue, I think that at the moment we don't have mandatory reporting. I think there should be mandatory reporting of underage sexual activity. It should always be a signal that there may be a danger of abuse going on. And at the moment, that that's not the clear message that goes out to school. And I think that's a message that should go to schools. I don't think schools should be in the business of providing contraception and abortion for their pupils. That's not their role at all. But those, the government encourages them to do. But in the case of girls and boys, indeed, that are under 16, I think it should always be the case that it should flag up a potential safeguarding concern, whatever. Okay, and that should be recorded. And then I think the other practical thing that could be done is to really confirm and look again at the Gillett competence. We've got these serious case reviews have said this really needs to be looked at urgently by the government, and the government have just ignored it. And it's not just one report, it's report after report. So this needs to be tackled. And one approach might be to look at the way that some states in America have gone, whereby you mandate parental involvement before decisions are taken over contraception and abortion. Obviously, there's issues about where abuse is sometimes involved in the family, and you need to have safeguards there as well, of course. But I think that would be a simple change, that it would no longer be legal to provide contraception or abortion to underage girls without the explicit permission and involvement of parents. It would be a very simple rule change, and I think that would be it wouldn't solve everything, but it would help us recognise that actually underage sexual activity shouldn't be normalised. It isn't something that we see as okay, and we actually, even worse, facilitate it by the actions and policies of the state. Really needs to be highlighted. So, Brooke, for example, have for many years promoted their what they call the traffic light tool for identifying potential abuse, and it was actually originally sort of done in Australia. When you look at this, they have a list of indicators, and they have green behaviour, amber behaviour, and red behaviour. And the green behaviour are things they list as positive. Green behaviours, they say, provide opportunities to give positive feedback and additional information. Okay, so they reflect safe and healthy sexual development. And when you look at the traffic light, so the latest published version, they say they've revised it now, and that's now behind a paywall. But this version is still, the original version is being used right across the country. It's easy to find it. I've got it here. This is their list for children aged 13 to 17. So children aged 13. This is a green behaviour, which is seen as positive.
Yeah.
And one of the green behaviours is consenting oral and or penetrative sex with others of the same or opposite gender who are of similar age and developmental ability.
13?
So they're saying for a 13, 14, 15-year-old that this should be seen, as long as it's consensual. That's all that matters for them. And as long as it's a similar age. Well, what's a similar age? I don't know. A 13-year-old with a 16-year-old, is that similar? A 13 to 15-year-old? I don't know. But I'm not sure that's particularly relevant. For a 13-year-old, they're saying that should be seen as something to give positive feedback. It's safe and healthy sexual development. Now, this is one of the foremost so-called sexual health organisations in the country, and this is the resource which has been promoted for a number of years, for nearly 10 years, and it's still easily available on websites. You can see lots of safeguarding organisations and local authorities promote this resource. And as I said, they on the Brooke website, they say, well, it was revised in 2020 and you have to pay to access it. So I don't know if that's changed significantly. I would hope it has, but it doesn't really change the fact that this is in widespread use across the country. Now, okay, it's absolutely appalling that an organisation like Brooke is, putting something out which I think perpetuates, if anything, the idea and normalises underage sexual activity for 13-year-olds. But the government should be stepping in. They should be saying this sort of resource should never be used as a safeguarding tool It provides completely the wrong message. Yet there it is. It's just sort of seen as an accepted, and Brooke are seen as almost a normal organisation. You know, they're not seen as some sort of extreme organisation promoting this kind of thing, but that's the reality. And when you show this to parents and indeed to teachers, and you sort of point this out, jaws sort of drop. But we shouldn't be in that situation where this sort of resource has been normalised.
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, it was also worrying to see today. I'm not sure if you've seen the news that the government have agreed to carry on allowing the DIY home abortions. You know, the ones that it was brought in, you know, during COVID. And I saw the news today that that's going to carry on, which is hugely concerning. That children, I suppose, could get a hold of these, and if that becomes normalised, it's something that you just do at home, and perhaps parents might not notice. And again, that's an easy way for abuse to carry on. I mean, if a partner, or not even a partner, but someone who's exploiting a young girl who then pressurizes her into doing one of these home abortions, you know, there's all kinds of worries going on there as well. Not
Yeah,
sure what
I
you
mean,
feel about that.
it's quite shocking, and
Mm,
it's an obvious, you know, abortion is obviously can be used as a way of hiding sexual abuse, and it's an obvious point. It's obviously a tragedy when somebody very, very young, or, you know, very sad when somebody that young gets pregnant in any case, but
mm.
then for it to be potentially hidden by this method, you're absolutely right. The abuser or the older person, there can be pressure to have the abortion, and it means that you're less likely, or you may be less likely, to observe and to be able to intervene with the sexual exploitation. So it's really, really worrying, and I think the government needs to get a handle on that side of things.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So regarding RSE in schools, obviously, you know, that's now become mandatory, and I think it's difficult for parents to be able to opt out of certainly. You know, it's just I've just had information come through for my own children's school, and it says although you can opt out up to a certain age from the RSE classes, that they strongly advise against it. You know, to put you in a position where you think, well, you don't want your child to be the odd one out. So it's a difficult one, I think, for parents. Have you got any advice for parents regarding RSE in schools?
Yeah, I mean, there is still the right to opt out. The change now is that ultimately it's up to the head teacher to decide whether that will be accepted or not. But I think any school worth its salt will always accept a parent who's sort of taking enough responsibility and has, for whatever reason, whatever concerns they might have, would rather their child doesn't participate in the school's provision of sex education. You'd hope that every responsible head teacher would allow that to happen. There's not necessarily many parents that will want to do that, but one of the things that having that right to opt out, it does provide a bit of a break on some of the materials which schools will use. If they're aware that, you know, parents may, if they don't like what's going on, and you know, take their children out of that provision, it may make schools think about, well, we do need to be involving parents. And I think my you know, thoughts on sex education in schools. You know, there can be a potential for schools to help parents and to contribute with healthy sexual development and provide useful information to young people at an age appropriate stage,
Mm.
as long as they're working with parents. I mean, you know, it's a long-standing principle of education in this country that it's the responsibility of parents, and schools are there to help parents educate their children in everything, but obviously particularly in this sensitive area. One of the things from the research evidence on sex education is that we shouldn't expect too much of it in schools. You know, people think, well, this is a way we're going to lower teenage pregnancy rates, or lower STIs, or reduce, you know, sexual abuse and so on. There's very little evidence that sex education in schools has those positive outcomes, in terms, certainly not in terms of reducing teenage pregnancies or STIs. And indeed, when you're promoting the morning after pill in schools, and you know, there's some evidence that can lead to an increase in sexually transmitted infections, because, you know, morning after pill offers no protection there, and it may encourage young people to engage in earlier sexual activity. So there are dangers with it.
Mm-hmm.
So we shouldn't say to parents, well, we have to have this information in schools because you know, because we're going to achieve these outcomes. You know, your child's going to be at less risk of getting pregnant. The evidence isn't there for that. And in a sense, that's quite liberating, because what we should be thinking is, well, how can schools contribute and help parents to, you know, to provide what their children need at the right age, an age-appropriate age, and to think, well, what is the right age? Schools shouldn't be afraid of doing too little, you know, because it, you know, sex education isn't this sort of panacea for all these other ills. They should really be thinking, well, okay, once we do sex education, one size doesn't fit all. Children develop at different ages. We shouldn't be rushing in and doing things too early. Clearly, they need to be careful about the types of material. I think there's, there have been some very worrying explicit materials that are used in sex education. But I think the thing for schools and for parents is to be really open and transparent. Schools should be saying to parents, right, this is what we're planning to, the information we're planning to give your children. Come in and have a look at it. Come in and have a look at the material. And if you've got any concerns, let us know. And parents, if a school isn't doing that, should be doing that themselves. If you're saying, okay, I understand this is coming up this year, there'll be some sex education. What are you exactly planning to do? Can I have a look at the materials? And that should be a very healthy conversation. That schools are sometimes nervous about involving parents because they think parents are going to say, oh no, don't do that. Well, actually, if a parent is worried about some of the material, schools should be thinking, are they right to be worried? And said, not one size doesn't fit all. So schools shouldn't be frightened of a parent saying, well, actually, my child isn't quite ready for this yet, so I'd rather they didn't have this approach and to withdraw. And that should be a positive development. It shouldn't be seen as a sort of worry. So my advice to parents is get involved, talk to your governors, look at your sex education policy. Don't assume. I think most schools want to do the right thing, and most teachers, they're not necessarily, they're given advice by government, which isn't always the best advice. We've seen from that sort of Brooke point on safeguarding. But I think most teachers genuinely, they want the best thing for their children. So parents going in constructively, trying to get that conversation going, and you hope that schools will respond. Now, when schools don't respond appropriately, then of course that's when parents need a bit of support perhaps from your organisation, from Family Education Trust, but there's also SPUC provider that they have a sort of safe at schools programme where they provide advice to parents to have an influence on the children. So there is support out there, and there's networks of parents as well. So you're not on your own if you're in that situation.
Yeah, okay, well, that's good to know. Well, we're looking forward to seeing you at the Family Education Trust conference on the 21st of May in London. Can you just share with our supporters what you're going to be talking about?
Yeah, I've been asked to talk about the sex education mandate. So countries that have compulsory sex education in schools, and what the statistical evidence is on the impact of that on sexual health outcomes and teenage pregnancy. And this really stems from a paper I published a year or so ago in the Journal of Health Economics, which was the first paper really to look across the world at the impact of these mandates. And the short answer is, well, actually they have not as much impact as you might think, and in fact some of the impacts are not necessarily positive. So some of the evidence was, if anything, they may make things worse. So I'll be sort of talking about that, and more generally the role of and the effects of school-based sex education, in terms, not so much in terms of whether it's right or wrong, but speaking in terms of somebody who looks at the data and the evidence. What are the impacts, where is the evidence stronger, what's the evidence on abstinence education? And I hope that'll be of interest to people at the conference.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. I'm sure it will. Is there anything else you want to share with us in this chat before we go?
No, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Lucy, and thank you to everyone at Family Education Trust for all the work you do on behalf of children and parents.
Oh, thank you. Well, we look forward to seeing you in May.